The predominant ideology of modernity is egalitarianism, the belief in human equality. People are egalitarians to different extents. In theory, there are conceptually normative and factual equality, which are quite different claims that carry different sets of demands for us in society. Most egalitarians today believe in both, and consequently, they believe that humans and their faculties and dispositions are uniform in level, and that we should treat them equally in society. They believe we are, at birth, born with equal intelligence, equal sensibility, equality in talents like art or philosophy, and equality in predispositions to behaviors. Liberals specifically vary on this question. It's common for them to be factual egalitarians, although some of them are normative egalitarians only. They believe that even if humans are not factually born equal, we ought to treat all humans equally for the sake of fairness and equity. This begs us to ask whether the normative position, which in my opinion is something of a noble lie, actually produces the equity that liberals believe it does. Leaving that question aside for the moment, let's explore another problem. Those who value egalitarianism also typically value difference, or what they call diversity, which they simply define as the total amount of variation in society. I have resources elsewhere on why I don't like this definition of diversity, but that aside, Popperian liberals might think that allowing personal expression in society liberates the individual, allowing for his unique insights to inform scientific endeavors and the development of culture. But here, factual egalitarians have a serious issue. If people are different, then they cannot be equal. Equality means sameness or uniformity. So if all people are equal, there would only be one type of person and hence no diversity. I've said this elsewhere, but Julius Evola made a similar argument against equality, both de facto, factual, and de jure, or normative. If all people are equal, then there is only one person, which is of course false. According to the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, if there are no differences between two things, then they are the same thing. We can tell there is obviously a panoply of different persons, so de jure equality is false. Factual equality is provably empirically false because we know that people differ in intelligence and personality due to genetic inheritance and mutation. Everything from how well you do in school to how likely you are to be addicted to drugs or alcohol is influenced by genes. The fact of different races, even if the differences were merely skin deep, is enough to demolish the scientific validity of factual egalitarianism, since the claim that it makes, that we are all born as uniform equals or exactly the same thing, is false. Thus, the de facto or factual equality doctrine is self-evidently false. Still, liberals cling on to the nostrum of equality as a centerpiece of their ideology. They believe that people are born naturally free and equal, and that de jure egalitarianism, or all men are equal under the law, best allows society to reach an equitable situation and flourish. This noble lie, however, does not actually produce equity, which is something that Marxists themselves have pointed out. When people are factually unequal, treating them as equals guarantees that those who are more naturally gifted than others will rise to the top economically and socially, while those who are at disadvantage genetically sit near the bottom. Communists regularly criticize liberalism on its inability to produce equity, since liberals are happy to give lip service to equality without actually endeavoring to use the government to engineer it. They are correct in this assessment, since this liberal lie, although for reasons communists would disagree with, does produce an unequal, stratified society in which an individual is not merely the product of his own actions, but rather the product of his genes. Even if liberals succeeded in creating a completely equal social environment, this problem would persist. Karl Popper likes to poo-poo Plato's stratified society and to pick on the caste system of feudal society simply because he believes in the absurd lie of human equality. Every problem he has with societal stratification could never be solved under his schema, and since it does not in any way take it into account, there's no way to guarantee equity of any sort. Pre-modern societies actually, on the other hand, provided at least a measure of dignity to the people that they stratified. Under liberal capitalism, one's dignity is proportional to one's wealth. For the working class, there is no dignity, even if their role is extremely vital to the well-being of society. What liberalism has done is to simply cover up the stratification and to strip it of any sacrality or dignity. Where a medieval peasant could have at least been proud to fulfill his role in the sacred society, accepting the lot that God has given him, a member of the liberal working class instead feels as though he has been punished for his station. He has no reason to accept being a have-not. He has nothing to be proud of. His hard labor, out of proportion to his pay, creates angst and agitation. He feels a victim of the system rather than a proud participator in the whole. To individualize society is to strip the individual of any meaning or purpose, to turn him into a listless unit with no identity. No recompense is enough to wash away the sting of capitalist class inequality, and thus, liberalism opens itself up to the communist revolt. Just as Plato pointed out in his writings about the civilization of his time, the class agitation in liberal society will be its downfall, because liberals failed to create a schema for human differentiation and inequality that might have given the common man spiritual purpose and a feeling of belonging. They have dug their own graves. In Popper's writing, he views inequality as a solvable injustice. Societies that are built on human inequality, or philosophies that acknowledge it, he views as reactionary and proximate or causal of fascism and totalitarianism. What Popper views as the precursor of fascism is, on the other hand, actually just a factual recognition of human differentiation, not necessarily fascism. Humanity is not just one collective, but rather it is differentiated into types. Any society that does not take this into account is inhuman, since there is no proper place for humans of a given type to flourish. Society then becomes a veritable anarchy, where each individual, on his own power alone, is left holding the bag. This produces alienation, angst, and class agitation. Pre-modern societies try to incorporate human differentiation into the structure of the state itself. With all forms of government, aristocracy most closely matches the truth about human diversity. Differences are heritable, not everyone is equally talented or wise, and we all have different reasons for living. To place those with the best traits at the top and those with the worst or the most mediocre traits at the bottom creates a kind of harmony and equilibrium that liberalism cannot reproduce, which is part of the reason for its instability. Liberalism is thus constantly in the midst of a revolution, and that revolution ends by obliterating it in favor of some illiberal system. This is what happened in Weimar Germany. This is what happened in Rhodesia and South Africa. Without some form of aristocratic stasis, liberalism commits suicide. It has to become illiberal to survive, and in fact, Popper somewhat agrees. Popper noted that liberalism, if it truly allowed the individual will to govern society, would fall apart and become supplanted by totalitarian ideology. To solve this problem, he posited that liberal societies had to be intolerant of tolerance, the paradox of intolerance that he's well known for. Only by controlling speech, political activity, and the beliefs of the masses can liberalism cease the conditions of anarchy through what Karl Popper calls piecemeal social engineering. However, by blocking off any avenue for the disgruntled, class-divided masses to unite against the system, liberalism sheds its sheep's clothing and instead shows that it can become host to a monstrous kind of totalitarianism, which is even more insidious and total than fascism. People want unity, and liberalism cannot provide it in the midst of its anarchy except at the end of a sword. They've decided that monitored and socially engineered anarchy is the only moral and just way to govern. History will prove that those who most set themselves apart from the tyrants end up simply becoming them. They were unwilling to accept the price of unity and stability, which is more or less what Popper calls derisively the closed society, and now they will be awash in revolution and nihilism, ending in totalitarianism. Popper had faith that the liberal society of the future will be one in which science is used to provide equity for everyone and to promote peace. However, what has been victorious instead is a philosophy that denigrates science and places the individual ego and its identifications in its place. It can no longer be taken for granted that men are men and women are women, as we know from biology. Equality has been used to demolish science because science is simply a white Western way of knowing. The careful set of complex systems that liberals have set up are now collapsing because even stratifying society by individual competence is now a violation of the nostrum of equality. Karl Popper never imagined that even a system of fair individual qualifications could come under scrutiny. But now there is growing such a crisis of incompetence that Popper's scientific open society itself groans under the strain. Equality and progress should no longer be viewed as companions, since equality destroys all the progress mankind has made in economics, industry, and art. The engine of technical progress is driven by the best people having all the necessary manpower and resources available to carry out their vision. And yet, this has been juxtaposed with the postmodern system of identities that tries to dismantle every height and deepen every depth. Because liberals did not want to create a system of excellence, because they did not want to constrain the individual in any way, because they did not want to create a system for human differentiation, they are dealing with the consequences of millions of people uprooted from what ought to have been their place in society. These rootless nomads will not stop until everything resembles a Dadaist painting, the abstract contortions of delusional egos deconstructing everything. All of this comes directly from the absurd belief in human equality. Progress is like a fortress and needs to be vigorously defended or it will be lost. The reason why medieval guilds were so well known for the quality of their crafts was because they carefully guarded their processes and techniques, ensuring they will be passed down to competent people generation after generation. Under the liberal condition of undifferentiated anarchy, this careful transmission of excellence is lost. Plato's intuition that humanity is subject to degenerescence when not constantly replenished from a stock of excellence is true, and those who deny it at their own peril. Popper shows his hand when he recommends that society be engineered. The only way to prevent anarchy from reaching the depths of societal dissolution is to stick your hands in and directly try to mold it. George Soros and the other members of the Open Society Foundation are proponents of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, or the merging of man and machine. They envision a future where anarchy is sustainable because there are no longer even any individual wills remaining to cause problems. Again, liberalism proves to be the host to the worst tyranny imaginable. On the other hand, that which Popper most criticized was never able to attain sufficient power to control every single individual right down to the level of their psychology. Feudal societies were organic. They formed through warlords conquering territory and setting themselves up as lords and taking vassals into their service. It was relatively decentralized, and lords were largely uninvolved in what their subjects did, aside from enforcing taxation. Evola describes it as a free exchange of loyalty, fealty, and bonds between humans orbiting around a stable center, that which most retarded progress best guaranteed liberty. Not negative liberty, of course, but rather the liberty of following just and divine laws. The closed society never managed to fully enact totalitarianism, even if Plato may have dreamed of it in his Republic. Liberalism, on the other hand, is in the cusp of creating a government so total it can control even your thoughts. That is the legacy of Popperianism, not liberty, but technomancer. One element of the leftist worldview is the proposition that non-white indigenous people should be left alone by white culture and civilization and to be allowed to follow their folkways and customs free from interference. This is part of the overarching idea of decolonization, undoing the merging of cultures and the cultural assimilation that has occurred during the past few centuries in order to liberate indigenous non-whites from what they see as oppression. But alongside this vision of decolonization, there's also the proposition of world equity, the desire to bring all cultures around the world into technological and economic parity with each other under the egalitarian notion that all people are fundamentally equal, and thus all disparities are the result of differential oppression and/or geographical factors. Juxtaposing these commitments has led me to realize that there is a vast incompatibility between these two prongs of leftist thought. If it is just to allow non-white indigenous people to their own cultural devices, then it would be impossible or contradictory to bring them up to parity with first world white nations for a number of factors. In the first place, non-white indigenous cultures are ascientific, or in other words, follow a scientific, quote-unquote, schema closer to shamanism or magic. This indisposes them towards scientific advancement in the Western sense, and so, if left to their own devices inside of their own territories, they will fail to make the advancements or reach the competence necessary to reach economic and technological parity with white civilization. For parity to occur naturally, leaving the question of intelligence differences aside, this would require such a radical divergence away from their traditional folkways so as to essentially constitute Western philosophical imperialism and hegemony over the non-white indigenous peoples who would have to abandon their folkways for the sake of scientific pursuits. Magical thinking would have to give in to rationality, uprooting and exteriorizing their relationship with their land, as hunting and gathering gives way to industrialized agriculture. What becomes highlighted here is that the Marxist preoccupation with progress butts up against the postmodern fascination with indigenous culture. Second, one might propose that, rather than expecting equity to be accomplished by non-white indigenous peoples themselves, white Western nations could instead give up some of their wealth to these non-white nations in order to achieve economic equality around the world. But of course, the proposition to Western nations that they should give up their dominant status in the world in exchange for essentially nothing will not appeal to any leader inside of those nations, so it would require the establishment of a hegemonic world government to accomplish. But as soon as any indigenous culture comes under the banner of a world government, they lose their sovereignty and identity. They would essentially be oppressed by yet another hegemonic system, even though the goal among leftist progressives is to eliminate oppression entirely. There's no guarantee that such a multipolar world government would ever respect the rights of indigenous peoples, and absolute power can be corrupted absolutely, meaning a precarious position for anyone caught under its grip. So in this way, the solution to equity, which is oppressive against white people, I might add, proves to be very predatory. Colonialism in many ways was actually a project of world equity. Europeans brought white innovations in culture and economics to peoples who had been deprived of them. For example, when the British came to India, they introduced railroads and eventually, with the help of the Theosophical Society, I might add, managed to overthrow the caste system, bringing a modern notion of social equality to India. In the West, we brought advanced technologies of agriculture as well as goods productions to the Amerindians, who occasionally assimilated into European culture. Assimilation, of course, breeds equity, but those who are against colonialism are against assimilation. Are they not also against equity? Would Indians have invented railroads themselves? I think not. The choice then remains clear. It's either equity or diversity. Decolonization cannot be anything other than the undoing of European attempts to bring equity to the non-white world, or the death of the white man's burden. A final oversight in the postmodern view is that itself it is hegemonic and colonialist in a sense. As I've said, traditional Indian culture was foundational in a caste system, the Varna Dharma. The Varna Dharma was an integral part of Indian spirituality, as it provided a privileged position in society for the priestly caste, whose material needs were provided for, so they could focus on serving the spiritual needs of society. In fact, the very basis of Indo-Aryan society is racist and hierarchical. Postmodern critiques of whiteness, oppression, and dominance hierarchies should apply equally to these pre-modern societies and the modern remnants thereof, even though they hold also the demand that these societies should be treated with respect and non-interference. Postmodernism amounts to a white attempt to deconstruct non-white societies until they resemble the culturally leftist West. Again, this demand for universal equity and non-discrimination butts up against the folkways of non-white culture. Marxism is a thoroughly modern ideology, and as a result, postmodern leftists need to seriously re-examine whether they agree with Marxist principles. The notion of world progress is contradictory to indigenous folkways, as indigenous culture emphasizes stability and tradition rather than growth and progress. Marx saw industrialization as an inexorable good for humanity, but what if industrialization threatens to mesh all people into a unified humanity, knowing no difference in creed and custom? There are definitely some appealing elements in postmodern thought. The notion of the value of world diversity is positive, as is the pronouncement against colonialism and the domination of other cultures. But in many ways, the nationalist view accomplishes these goals better than the preoccupation postmodernists have with Marxism and world equity. It turns out that diversity and equity are not allies, they are instead bitter enemies. Equity is sameness, while diversity is disparity. Either we accept these disparities for the sake of a diverse globe, as the nationalists do, or we rebel against them, creating a bland singularity as the leftists do. We cannot have both. Until leftists recognize that their precious Marxism is incompatible with their vision for the world, they will continue dragging us toward the brink of a global melting pot, which will outdo colonialism in its ability to obliterate unique cultures and ways of life.